I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Qatar to introduce an address by the head of state.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to introduce the recorded statement by His Highness Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, Emir of the State of Qatar. In the name of God, the Merciful, the Compassionate. Your Excellency, President of the General Assembly, Your Excellency, Secretary General of the United Nations, ladies and gentlemen, may the peace and blessings of God be upon you. At the outset, I congratulate His Excellency, Mr. Volkan Bozkir, on assuming the presidency of the 75th session of the General Assembly, wishing him every success. I also thank His Excellency, Mr. Tijani Muhammad Bande, President of the previous session, for the appreciated efforts he exerted during his tenure, and I avail myself of this opportunity to commend the role of His Excellency, the Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, in promoting the role of the United Nations and achieving its goals. Mr. President, this session coincides with celebrating the 75th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations, and it is opportune on this occasion to remember that the UN is an institutional embodiment of our awareness that we belong to one humanity. There are many historical experiences that prove this fact and show that we should not underestimate it. The outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic has reminded us that we live on the same planet and that multilateral cooperation is the only way to address the challenges of epidemics and the challenges related to the climate and the environment. We ought to remember that also when dealing with the issues of poverty, war, and peace, and achieving our common goals of security and stability. The State of Qatar promptly took all necessary preventative measures to protect its citizens and the residents on its territory. However, it has also provided aid to more than 60 countries and 5 international organizations. We have been participating actively in international efforts to mobilize resources and capacities to address this epidemic and its repercussions. We have been supporting research centers in several countries to reduce the negative effects of this pandemic and to expedite the development of a vaccine for this virus. Mr. President, more than 3 years have passed since the start of the unjust and illegal blockade on the State of Qatar. Nevertheless, we kept to the path towards progress and development in various fields. Despite the blockade, Qatar has strengthened its effective participation in the multilateral international efforts to find solutions to different crises. Throughout the unjust and unlawful blockade, we have consolidated our policies, which are based on the respect of the principles and provisions of international law and the United Nations Charter, especially the principle of respecting the sovereignty of states and rejecting any interference in the internal affairs of states. We bear a moral and legal responsibility towards our peoples. We have stressed, and we will continue to stress, that unconditional dialogue based on common interests and respect for the sovereignty of states is the way to solve this crisis. It started with imposing an illegal blockade, and lifting this blockade would be the first step to end it. On this occasion, I reiterate my deep appreciation for the sincere efforts of His Highness Sheikh Sabah Al Ahmed Al Jaber Al Sabah, Emir of the Brotherly State of Kuwait, and I would like to highly value the efforts of other brotherly and friendly countries to bring this crisis to an end. Ladies and gentlemen, there is international consensus on the fact that the Palestinian cause is a just cause, but despite this consensus, the international community stands by, unable to take any effective action to confront Israeli intransigence, its continued occupation of Palestinian and Arab land, the imposition of a stifling siege on the Gaza Strip, the expanding settlement policy, among others. Israel is imposing a fait accompli in a flagrant violation of international resolutions and the two-state solution agreed upon by the international community. Just peace can only be achieved when Israel fully commits to the international terms of reference resolutions that that are accepted by the Arab countries and upon which the Arab Peace Initiative is based. Israel is trying to circumvent these parameters and acts as if the Palestinian cause did not exist. Any arrangements that are not based on these parameters will not achieve peace, even if they are called arrangements for peace. Those arrangements do not aim to achieve just solution to the Palestinian cause. They do not aim to achieve comprehensive, just and lasting peace. Failure to find a just solution to the Palestinian cause, Israel's continued settlements, and forcing a new reality on the ground without being deterred, this is what raises the biggest question about the credibility of the international community and its institutions. We call upon the international community, especially the Security Council, to assume its legal responsibilities and compel Israel to lift the siege on Gaza Strip, to put the peace process back on track through credible negotiations based on international resolutions and not on force. Negotiations must address all final status issues. They must end the occupation within a specific time frame. They must lead to the establishment of an independent Palestinian state within the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. They must end the Israeli occupation of all Arab territories. As part of our efforts to create the appropriate conditions to achieve peace and to respond to the economic and humanitarian difficulties facing our brothers in Palestine, we, in coordination with our international partners, have continued providing humanitarian and development aid to respond to the urgent and long-term needs in the besieged Gaza Strip, in addition to increasing our contributions to UNRWA. Mr. President, we firmly believe in resolving disputes by peaceful means. With the grace of God, the state of Qatar's mediation efforts have culminated in signing a peace agreement between the United States and the Taliban movement in Doha on the 29th of February 2020. Discussions held in Doha last month led to the successful exchange of prisoners between the government of Afghanistan and the Taliban movement. In cooperation with our international partners, we successfully contributed to convening the intra-Afghan peace negotiations, which began on the 12th of this month in Doha. The success of these negotiations now depends on our Afghan brothers themselves. In cooperation with the international community, we will spare no effort to facilitate the dialogue, in the hope that peace and stability would soon prevail across Afghanistan if everyone decides to completely renounce violence and accept diversity and equal citizenship. Mr. President, more than 9 years have passed since the beginning of the Syrian crisis. It has brought unprecedented tragedy to people's lives, and its impact is getting worse year after year. Yet, the crisis has not been resolved due to the intransigence of the Syrian regime and the failure of the international community, especially the Security Council, to assume its duty to maintain international peace and security and protect civilians. The Syrian regime still obstructs even the process of drafting a new constitution proposed by Russia, which unfortunately is all that was left of the international efforts aiming to achieve some form of a peaceful solution. The regime deals with this process using the same stalling tactics it has used before. It responded to the requests of the international community and is participating in the negotiations, but without any intention to make any change. On this occasion, I reiterate the firm stance of the State of Qatar that the only way to end the Syrian crisis is a political solution based on the Geneva I communiqué and the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2254. The State of Qatar also affirms that it will continue with the international community to support efforts to achieve justice and hold accountable perpetrators of atrocities, war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in Syria. In the humanitarian field, we will continue to provide all forms of support and assistance to the brotherly Syrian people in IDP and refugee areas until the end of this crisis. As for the raging war in sisterly Yemen, which is destroying its infrastructure, depriving the Yemeni people of the basic necessities of life, and threatening security in the region, we stress that the only way to resolve this crisis is through negotiation among the Yemenis in accordance with the outcomes of the national dialogue, the Gulf Initiative, relevant Security Council resolutions, particularly Resolution 2216. We stress our firm position to maintain the unity of Yemen and its territorial integrity. As for the brotherly Sudan, we value the signing of a peace agreement in Juba between the transitional government in Sudan and a number of armed movements. We express our appreciation to the state of South Sudan for sponsoring the signing of this agreement, and we look forward to the rest of the factions joining the peace process. We stress the firm stance of the state of Qatar. We will stand by the brotherly Sudanese people to successfully overcome this transitional period and achieve their aspirations for stability and development. We reiterate the call to the relevant countries to facilitate the efforts of the brothers in Sudan to remove the name of Sudan from the list of states sponsoring terrorism, as the hardships that the Sudanese people are facing has taken its toll on them. Qatar stood with the brothers by providing them with support to respond to the floods that severely damaged facilities and harmed people, and we call upon the international community to provide them with the necessary support to respond to natural disasters. Regarding the Libyan issue, we reiterate that we welcome the ceasefire agreement and the activation of the political process in accordance with the outcomes of the Sukhayrat agreement to achieve a comprehensive political settlement that will maintain Libyan sovereignty, territorial integrity and independence, that would stem the bloodshed and preserves Libya's wealth. Everybody must understand that it is impossible to impose a military regime by force in Libya. We were pained by what Lebanon went through in the aftermath of the explosion at the port of Beirut. We stood by our Lebanese brothers without conditions. It is not our habit to impose political conditions to show solidarity during disasters, but in the end, it will be incumbent upon the Lebanese themselves, and not by diktats, to find agreed upon ways for reform, to fulfill the aspirations of an entire generation for a state based on citizenship rather than any other affiliations. This, incidentally, is an aspiration shared by the younger generation across the entire region. Ladies and gentlemen, terrorism remains one of the most prominent challenges facing the world, as it poses a real threat to international peace and security. It impedes achieving sustainable development for all. We, in the state of Qatar, spare no effort to actively participate in international and regional efforts to address this phenomenon and tackle its roots, especially by supporting education of millions of children, young people and women, and creating job opportunities for young men. In this context, young men and women. In this context, Qatar is strengthening the strategic partnership with the relevant United Nations agency. I'm referring here to the opening of a program office of the United Nations Counterterrorism Office in Doha next May to implement behavior-related approaches to combating terrorism and violent extremism. Mr. President, as part of its efforts to provide development assistance to developing countries and the least developed countries, and support to countries affected by the negative impact of climate change, Qatar has fulfilled its pledge by providing a contribution of $100 million to support the least developed countries and small island developing states to deal with climate change. We are pleased to host the 5th United Nations Conference on the Least Developed Countries in Doha from the 23rd to the 27th of January 2022. We're confident that this conference will support their efforts towards achieving development throughout the next decade, in line with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. In conclusion, we reaffirm the State of Qatar's commitment to the declaration adopted by the General Assembly on the 21st of September, with the participation of the heads of state and government, and in which the State of Qatar assumed, in partnership with the Kingdom of Sweden, a role in facilitating the international negotiations for its adoption. We will continue to work with the United Nations to achieve its goals and address the common challenges to pursue the interests of our peoples and for the good of humanity. Thank you, and may God's peace, mercy and blessings be upon you.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the Emir of Qatar for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Philippines to introduce an address by the head of state.